Welcome. People will probably keep coming into the room for a few minutes here, but want to go ahead and do a quick introduction, explain what Journey Through the Author Bank is. Hopefully you have joined us before. So we do this every Thursday night. And the idea here is to go through the whole CLT Author Bank over the next couple of years. We did C.S. Lewis last week, had a lot of fun doing this. And kind of our goal here is to put students in front of top professors at top colleges that we dearly love here at CLT. And this is important because 2/3 of all the passages that we put in front of students on the CLT 10, and the CLT 8, they all come from the CLT Author Bank. And so we call this JTAB, or Journey Through the Author Bank. And again, our goal here is to give you a chance to also hear from some of our favorite professors at some of our favorite colleges. And one of those is certainly the Honors College at Belmont Abbey. For the very first time, I got a chance to visit just last week. And I went there, Dr. Basil, with high expectations. I'd heard really amazing things. And I think my expectations were still very much blown away. It's an incredible program that Dr. Joseph Wysocki has built. I think a lot of CLT test takers, families I've connected with that are looking at places like TAC or maybe Thomas More or Benedictine or Franciscan. Increasingly, Belmont Abbey, and in particular, the Honors College at Belmont Abbey is on that list as well. So it's a really incredible program. And a couple of the things that stand out to me about it that are really unique is that you get a deep dive into the great books through an incredible honors college with an incredible faculty. But then also there's an opportunity to have a kind of regular major as well. That makes the program really unique. And then also, the price point really can't be beat. I'm kind of blown away when Dr. Wysocki has shared with me the price point for going to the Honors College at Belmont Abbey. It seems to be kind of the best of all things. And in addition to that, you're on a beautiful campus with monks. Belmont Abbey is a Benedictine college. You have the president of the monastic life there. And what's really cool is the monks at Belmont Abbey, they take a vow of stability. So if you go to Belmont Abbey and you graduate and you come back for like your 50th anniversary or something, they're probably still going to be right there. And I think in a world that is ever more transient and everybody is always on the move, it's a really beautiful thing to meet people who are committed to a place over time. If you have not visited campus at Belmont Abbey, definitely do that. At the end of our time tonight, we'll do kind of an open Q&A with Dr. Basil about what is the experience like for students at the Honors College. We want to make sure that all of your questions get answered. And then you could also get a good idea of when to visit, if you can do that maybe sometime this spring. But I'm excited now to make this introduction. So we are doing Aristotle tonight on the CLT Author Bank. I've known Dr. Basil now for probably 6 or 7 years. I think you were fresh out of Baylor where you did your PhD. Is that accurate?
I think so. I think that sounds
good. When we first connected, and now you have been at Belmont Abbey for I guess 4 years now.
Yeah,
4 years. And before students came into the room, I was asking you a bit about it, and you were kind of like, I want to be a lifer here. I love this place so much. And knowing students, our own Alec Bianco at CLT here, whose dad Matt Bianco runs the Circe Institute along with Andrew Kern. Matt's daughter, Alex's sister, is a student in the Honors College. I guess just today, Christine gave her, was it her dissertation or her presentation?
Yeah, her thesis presentation.
Her thesis presentation. Okay,
yeah.
Her thesis presentation. But I hear about it all the time, the amazing experience she has had. So, but we will start with Aristotle, and I will turn it over now to Dr. Basil. So Dr. Basil, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, I'm just delighted to be here, and I'm so happy to share with you. It's a little weird not being able to see your faces, but I mean, at some point there'll be room for discussion, and I'm just So with that, let's just dive right in. I think to the question of who Aristotle is and what in particular I focused on, and what I think would be fun to talk about tonight, and what might spark some interest. So. First of all, who is Aristotle? I think is the first question, and the truest answer is that he is an exotic Macedonian man, unlike his teacher, his very famous teacher Plato. Aristotle is not Athenian, right? there's a very sort of famous triumvirate in philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Aristotle is the student of Plato, but he's not like Plato, and he's not like Socrates. He's not Athenian. He comes from Macedonia to study with Plato, but unlike so many students who come to college and around the age of 17 or 18 and stay there for about 4 years, Aristotle leaves Macedonia and comes to Athens to study with Plato. And instead of staying for 4 years, he stays for about 20 years to study with his teacher, who is just, and it's very clear, I think, in all of Aristotle's writings, that there's a very close friendship between himself and his teacher, and that as the more I read Aristotle, the more I read Plato, it's very clear that in a certain way they're always in dialogue together. One of at least in Aristotle's mind, right? And there's a couple ways of trying to think about Aristotle's uniqueness, and one thing to think about is that I like to ask students on the first day of class is what department they think Aristotle would be in if he were in a modern university. And the answer tends to be, well, he'd be somewhere, he writes all these books on logic, he writes all these books on parts of animals, he's interested in physics, in metaphysics, in the thing that I tend to be most interested in the moral life, and in really the question of how to live well. So Aristotle, I think, is incredible in the sense that he is interested in the whole. And there's no one thing, there's not a question that I don't think he's not interested in. And in fact, if there is a question to ask, he's probably asked it and begun to explore it in some ways. So the book that I want to focus on for sort of tonight's account of Aristotle is his this little book, this hefty little book called the Nicomachean Ethics. It might be backwards on your screen, I don't know. But Aristotle very famously writes this book called the Nicomachean Ethics. And it seems to be, in so many ways, a kind of teacherly or almost fatherly advice. Nicomachean, what is a Nicomachean? Well, it seems to be derived from Nicomachus, who might be a grandfather of Aristotle, or it might be his son. We're not quite sure. And really, this book is about the ethos, the character, and how we cultivate character and its relation to happiness. So this, I think, is why happiness, and in what way is that question a part of liberal education? I think might be one thing to ask, and then the other sort of thing to ask would be, well, how to go about thinking about this? How does Aristotle start talking about this? So why is the question of happiness, I think, part of Aristotle's, one of his main inquiries, one of the questions or perplexities he wants to ask? And I think in so many ways, the question of happiness, that as he asks it, is really, in so many ways, the only question that we're asking all the time, right? Because at every moment of our lives, we are living an answer to the question of what we believe happiness to be, right? And this is expressed in so many different ways, but when we even have our idioms or actions speak louder than words. At every moment in our speeches and our deeds and our actions, we are living an answer to the question of what happiness is. And any serious life, requires that we think about what it really means to be happy, and how much of happiness is up to us. Because obviously, everyone in their heart of hearts desires to be happy. This is one of the sort of central desires that all human beings have. And Aristotle, in helping us think about happiness, gives us a really profound answer. And one thing that I think is always important to think about is how to read a book, right? This is in a great books education, and I teach in this great books program, right? Thinking about how to read a book is really important. And Aristotle seems to be, to most people, very different than his teacher Plato. If you've ever read a Platonic dialogue, from the Apology to the Crito to the Republic, the Meno, and my students all start reading Plato. And Plato's dialogues are notoriously what's called aporetic. They seem to ask a question like, what is justice? Or what is virtue? Or and can it be taught? And they ask one of these big questions that we all have. What is justice? And as the dialogue unfolds, you think you're understanding things, and then you get to the end and you are literally then sometimes confused about what you think you've learned at the end. And that you are almost, what's induced by Plato is aporia, which literally means aporos, without a door or without a way through. And so when you read Plato, you are learning how to ask questions, right? And it's and sometimes the answers are hard to figure out as they're contained in the text. Well, Aristotle has a very different reputation. And when Aristotle writes, people tend to think of him as dogmatic, right? Because when he writes, he gives a lot of definitions. And so he actually does have a definition of happiness. And it's a funny definition. It goes something like this: happiness is an activity of the soul in accord with reason or virtue, and as the prudent person would define it, over the course of a complete life. But most of the time when we talk about it, it's something like, well, happiness is an activity of soul in accord with virtue. And you think, good. Now, if I were taking a test, I could answer the question of what happiness is. And that would be worth yes, eudaimonia, Olivia tells me, exactly. And it's in Greek too, that's wonderful. When you think about that, that definition could be very helpful, but it also could mean almost nothing. And so unlike Plato, who asks questions and then explores the problems of the question, Aristotle seems to begin with a definition and then question the definition. And so as the text unfolds and the way he writes, it appears to be dogmatic until you realize that as soon as he gives you a definition, he shows you everything that is left, every question that is raised by the definition that he's given. And so there's something very dialogical or very dialectical about the way the text is written. He gives you a definition, he moves forward, and then he confuses you, and in fact induces all the perplexities that Plato induces. And I would just say one of the things that I've found most liberating about liberal education, the way in which liberal education that we engage through the ancients occurs, is by learning how to encounter what is perplexing, because life is always perplexing, right? There are always situations where you are going to find yourself in that you think, my goodness, nobody ever taught me how to deal with this one, right? Nobody ever sat down and told me how to deal with this problem that I face on a Tuesday afternoon. But here I am. I wonder what I should do. And it is that experience of being perplexed by questions and continually facing uncertainty in our encounters with reality that I think is one of the most liberating aspects of a liberal education. It is freeing in the sense that it teaches us how to exercise freedom in the midst of our uncertainty. And so there are a couple things that I would just want to raise as sort of introducing Aristotle and his way of talking about happiness. In the Ethics, if you've ever heard a conversation about virtue, and some of my students tell me that they are fiends for virtue, they just love virtue. Aristotle is in the life of the West really foundational in giving us an account of what virtue is and exploring that at great length. And in fact, most of the Nicomachean Ethics provides the foundation of an account of virtue that through a kind of adaptation by Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages is sort of all pervasive. And that definition of virtue is something like this: virtue is a mean between two extremes. It's a kind of way of choosing how we face the things that we suffer, right? And it is really intriguing in the ethics that in a book about happiness, the primary focus, at least for most of the book that Aristotle has, is on thinking about what it is to be virtuous, right? And I'll work up to this in a roundabout way, but I'll tell you right now essentially why he's so concerned with virtue. When thinking about happiness, right, there are always certain things, everyone desires to be happy, but the one thing Aristotle notices that anyone looking for happiness is going to notice is that people disagree about what it is, right? People have very radically different and sometimes even opposing or conflicting definitions of happiness. And so if you're looking around trying to figure out, well, which way should I live? Who am I? What is happiness for me? Well, it could be very confusing. And so what Aristotle does in this text is he looks at common opinions about happiness, and he moves us from exploring the different convictions about happiness that various people have, and he moves us into thinking about what a serious life, a serious pursuit of happiness would look like. So everyone lives some definition of happiness, but not everyone seems to be very happy, right? So how do we look at move from being curious about happiness to being serious about it? And the sort of intermediary step there is virtue, right? Because there are so many things when it comes to happiness that we would say constitute a happy life, and even modern social science gives us some pretty good clues, mostly clues that every 12-year-old with common sense could tell you, but it gives us some clues. Like, people who are happy tend to be in stable families, in stable communities. They tend to be religious. They tend to be have deep loves. They tend to be thoughtful. They tend to be serious about a certain work. That there are certain things we can look at and say, these are general parts of happiness, right? Living a meaningful life means having a certain degree of balance between different goods. And in fact, every time we think about the good, we are always aiming at what is good. And in fact, Aristotle thinks about the whole pursuit of happiness as the pursuit of what is good. And not just what is good absolutely, but what is good for me. But if you think about any good, there are always external goods and internal goods. And sometimes external goods that are involved with happiness are apart from our control. So think about this. And I use this example in class because sometimes in the Honors College, I play ultimate Frisbee with my students because I'm slightly competitive and so are they, right? And they do generally beat me. But here's the example is if we're going to play a game of Frisbee, and Frisbee is of course part of the good life, right? It's part of the pursuit of happiness. Athletics, excellence in sport is part of a good life. Well, what do you need to play a game of Frisbee? Well, you need some external goods. You need a disc, you need friends, you need a field, you need your legs, you need your arms, you need a certain degree of health, you need sight, right? And if you start to think about this, this is a small part of happiness, the game of ultimate Frisbee, but it is a significant part. But even that one little part of happiness that consists in playing sport needs goods that are beyond which I can control, right? So for example, what if I can't find a disc? There's no game. What if I can't find my friends? No game. What if my legs are broken? Maybe I can sit in the end zone, but still gonna be really hard to play this game, right? It's still gonna be difficult, right? So what does that show you? Well, it shows you that any activity of the soul, which is necessarily wrapped up in the activity of the body to some degree, requires or depends upon goods that I don't necessarily have control over, right? And so when we begin to think about happiness, one of the first things Aristotle forces his readers to confront in the first book of the Ethics is the question of chance and fate, right? Because there are certain things that are beyond my control when it comes to happiness. And so what if the things, the external goods on which depends the exercise of my own activity of soul, right? My own virtue, and my own happiness. What if those things are taken away? You know, and can I still be happy? Or and so the real question that Aristotle want to provoke is the problem of chance, right? And really, I think what he's thinking about is a view of happiness that's sort of contained in Greek tragedy, which often suggests that human beings are the subject of fate. They're victims of fate. They can't help what happens to them. They are subject to the gods, and what the gods determine, they have no choice. They have no freedom, and there's nothing that we can do that can ultimately help us control our happiness. Exactly, Oedipus, right? It's precisely the problem of Oedipus. It's really the problem of all tragedy, that we see ourselves as victims of fate. And in fact, we see this in the modern world all the time. Like when we call ourselves victims, when we determine certain classes are victims, there's a kind of fatalism in that. And the question that Aristotle wants to raise for us is, well, do you want to be a victim of fate? Or is there something about happiness over which you have control, right? And as he discusses happiness, Aristotle will acknowledge in the first book of the Ethics that there are indeed certain parts of happiness that are beyond our control. And yet virtue is such a crucial thing to look at, because it is in fact the only part of happiness that is up to me. It is the only part of happiness over which I have control. And that doesn't mean I have control over every external circumstance, but it does mean that I have a choice in how to respond to the passions and to the actions of life and the circumstances that I suffer. And so virtue is, when he begins to define it, he speaks of it as a characteristic. And the word for characteristic in Greek is a beautiful one. It's called a hexis, and it literally means a holding. And so virtue is a certain way of holding oneself towards reality. And I really like that, because when he begins to define and talk about virtue, what it is and how we acquire it, Aristotle uses a particular analogy about how to grow in virtue that I find really compelling. And it's the analogy of weightlifting, right? And I'll just read you this, because he uses some fascinating analogy in book 2, chapter 2, right? And he says, this is manifest in the case of strength. It comes into being as a result of taking much nourishment and enduring many exertions. And he who is strong would be especially able to do just these things, that is, endure many exertions. So too in the case of the virtues. For as a result of abstaining from pleasures, we become moderate. And by so becoming, we are especially able to abstain from them. Similar is the case of courage as well. By being habituated to disdain frightening things and to endure them, we become courageous. And by so becoming, we will be especially able to endure frightening things. So this is the analogy, or at least as one of my students put it once, and everyone groans when I say this, but you want to get swole in the soul. And I kind of want that on one of the honors college like swag t-shirts, and I'm just like hoping that happens someday. Because virtue is like a muscle that has to be exercised, particularly moral virtues, because there are always places in our for various reasons, because of our nature or because of our education, that we're weak. And for example, most of my friends would never believe this now, but when I was a kid, I was extremely shy, right? I was extremely shy. And I hated having to talk on the phone. I hated talking to librarians. I hated any kind of public thing. And so because my father was wise, he would send me out into any new situation, kick me out of the car and say, go be confident and go be friendly. And I would say, oh, and yeah, right. over and over again, that happened. And anytime I shied away from a phone call, guess what? I was compelled to get on the phone. Anytime I didn't look an adult in the eye, I was compelled to go back and talk to the adult who I refused to look in the eye. And over time, what happened in that very minor case in my own life is that suddenly those things that were once extraordinarily painful, well, they might be painful, but for different reasons, right? It's not excruciatingly painful when you begin to continually face and endure something that is painful. And so virtue comes into being in that manner in every way, right? Where we find ourselves weak, where we find ourselves deficient in being able to choose what is actually good, virtue is something that grows over time in the course of a complete life. And virtue is that part of happiness which is up to me. And it is very beautifully, as Aristotle puts it, the work of a lifetime. It's the work of a complete life. And one of the things he says early on in book one is, one swallow does not make a spring, right? Nor one day. Virtue is the work of a lifetime, which means if today I find myself weak in different ways and have in all honesty have to acknowledge that there's still a lot of areas where I have to grow, there's something deeply hopeful that I can, in the same way that I can build strength in my body in exercising, I can grow in strength of soul over time. There's a kind of helpful figure to think about in all of this, and his name is Priam. I don't know if any of you have probably encountered maybe the Iliad of Homer. Oh, good. But I think there's a figure Aristotle continually brings up, and yes, the person I'm talking about is Priam. Aristotle talks about Priam a whole bunch in the Ethics, especially when he's talking about the problem of fate, right? And the reason I think is something, for those of you who maybe haven't read the Iliad or don't know who Priam is, he's almost a figure that looks like the Homeric version of the biblical Job, right? If you think about Job, right? Job in the Bible raises for us the question of suffering, right? He's a good man. He's lived a good life, right? And yet he loses everything, his wealth, his family, his children. It's awful. And in the Bible, right, Job is sort of wrestling with God to say, like, what is this? Well, and it's a troubling question. In a different way, in the pagan world, Priam is someone who, in the context of the Trojan War, loses his children, all of his sons. He loses his city, and then he dies an ignominious death in front of his wife. And when Aristotle is raising the problem of chance, he brings up Priam, because what if you're a really good person, right? And you've lived a pretty good life, maybe not perfect, but you're okay. And then you face chance suffering, right? Can you still be happy? Aristotle looks at this, and without denying the reality of the possibility of tragedy in human life, what he seems to say about Priam and someone who suffers like Priam, well, he says a couple different things, and he develops an answer over time, right? The first thing he says is, time is too short, and our vision of the future is too limited to know precisely what the future has in store. And so that while virtue cannot keep us from suffering the greatest of misfortunes, virtue can, in fact, the virtuous soul would endure even the sufferings of Priam differently. And even if he suffered for a great time, a long time, there is a chance that over the course of enduring even the greatest of humanly possibly imaginable misfortunes, I think I said that weirdly, but whatever, right? Even enduring the worst thing you can imagine, that over the course of that, what could be born in the soul would be a nobility beyond what could have been imagined before. And when Aristotle actually talks about something in his rhetoric, my favorite, I don't know which is more my favorite text of Aristotle, the rhetoric or the ethics, but in the rhetoric, he speaks about this thing called the redemption of memory. And it is that even if something has been extraordinarily painful while we are going through it, right? You think of, and everybody has had painful moments in their life. One of the things that happens in memory when it comes to noble things is that even very painful things can become beautiful in time. Because when what has the fruit of that suffering has made somehow the suffering worth it, right? And because our lives are short and yet our future is beyond what we can imagine, what Aristotle seems to say is even the worst suffering can be the cause of greatest nobility in the soul, right? And so there's something extraordinarily hopeful that even in looking at the worst imaginable sufferings as a human being, that there's a way in which focusing on that part of happiness which we control, virtue, allows us to face even the most strenuous and difficult circumstances with a determination and a hope that something beautiful can grow from this thing, right? And that is coming from a man without the aid of Christian revelation. That on the natural level, there's a certain kind of natural hope that can allow for a kind of hope in healing over time. Because it's not just that we don't know what the future holds, it's that often we don't know what capacity for greatness we might have before we suffer. And if you ever hear, I think wiser, older people talk about their lives, often they say, yeah, I was young once, and therefore I did this crazy thing. And if I had known how hard it would be, I never would have done it. But somehow, and my thought as a kid is always, or not as a kid, but as a younger person is always something like, yeah, but you did it. And you made it. And now you're amazing in these various ways that you never would have been without that particular form of suffering. And Aristotle helps us to see that. One of the things, though, that he talks about with virtue is he develops this theme of thinking about Homer and his poetry throughout the text. And that's just one almost tangential, but not totally tangential thing. Aristotle does have a teacher named Plato, but both Plato and Aristotle have a teacher who's much older named Homer. And one of the things that I think has been fascinating to explore in the curriculum that I teach in the Honors College is the relationship between philosophy and poetry. It's one of the oldest quarrels or the oldest questions, but and sometimes it's thought that there's a great division between poetry and philosophy. The reality, though, is that there is a constant dialogue between Plato and Homer and Aristotle and Homer. And why? Because literature always fleshes out, makes incarnate in a certain way the different elements of philosophy, right? So you're not just thinking about courage, you might be thinking about the courage of Achilles, or the courage of David in the Bible, right? You can think about a virtue much more precisely if you can think about a particular person who seems to embody that virtue, right? And Aristotle seems to me just profoundly human in his awareness that we need incarnational ways of thinking about eternal questions, right? And literature, poetry provides us with these things. So when Aristotle introduces virtue in book one, it's sort of like, it's very exciting because it makes you think, well, maybe I could become virtuous and great and even deeply happy. When he talks about virtue, though, it becomes clear that that virtue actually, when you start to focus on what is actually within your control and you let go of the things outside of your control, that there's something that really grows there. And it's not that you ever gain complete control over your life, but there's a certain steadiness and stability of character that develops. And I'll just maybe just to carry through the example of Priam and how this dialogue between philosophy and poetry might help us think about virtue. When Aristotle in book 2 of the Ethics is really, after he's introduced the problem of happiness and then introduced virtue as a kind of focal point, it's that part of happiness which is left up to us. He goes through book 2 defining happiness. But at the very end of book 2, in defining virtue, he comes back to the story that we find in the Iliad. And the reason he does so is because anytime we need to think about virtue, we need to look at the places where we are both strong and weak. Because you probably know this just by looking at people, right? Or even looking at yourself, right? That there are certain virtues that we might more readily incline to than others. Some people are just more courageous by nature. Right? Some people are more moderate by nature. Some people are more generous by nature. And different natures are going to more easily manifest different virtues. But if I'm naturally moderate, but not courageous, well, it's courage that I need to grow in much more than moderation, right? And so Aristotle has some very practical advice, and this might be kind of the way to bring this full circle. Because the question of happiness is always one of self-knowledge, right? Happiness and the pursuit of living well is ultimately the only reason I'm asking that question is because I want to know how to be happy, right? And that's just true for all of us. Why would we think about the good if it weren't good for us? Right? There's a deep desire in every human being to be happy. And that actually requires thinking about, in my own life, what would be the most satisfying answer to that question. And so Aristotle invites us to a kind of self-reflection when it comes to virtue. And this is what he says. He says, one must examine what we ourselves readily incline toward. For some of us naturally inclined to some things, others to some other things. This object of our inclination will be recognizable from the pleasure and the pain that occur in our case. And we must drag ourselves away from it towards its contrary. For by leading ourselves far from error, we will arrive at the middle term, the mean, that is virtue, which is in fact what those who straighten warped lumber do. But in everything, one must be especially on guard against the pleasant and pleasure, for we do not judge it impartially. What the town elders felt towards Helen, then, is what we too ought to feel towards pleasure. And in all cases, we ought to utter their remark. For by thus dismissing pleasure, we will err less. By doing these things, then, to speak in a summary fashion, we will be most able to hit on the middle term. And so, how do I know, right, where I need to grow in virtue, that part of happiness that is up to me? Well, I have to be very honest about what is pleasant and what is painful, right? I mean, if you think about this in a very practical way, if there's ever been a situation where you might overreact, right? And you're like, I don't know why I was so angry because it didn't seem like that big a deal. Well, there's a pain there, right? And that tells you something about a point of sensitivity or weakness that might need some healing or growth, right? If there's an excessive pleasure that I just can't stop. I mean, my example is always Nutella. Like, I mean, there's an excessive pleasure in life, and you just find that like your great vice is sort of Nutella eating. Then, well, what that tells me something, right? And so, anytime we're seeking to grow in virtue, virtue is a response to the unchosen passions that we suffer, right? So, but this is Aristotle's incredible advice, and the way this comes full circle to Priam. When it comes to virtue, we need to be a little bit on guard against the pleasant, because we love pleasure. We're human beings. It's very natural. And so we need to be suspicious, or at least open to self-examination, lest we suffer the fate of Priam, which in fact is not as much a matter of fate as it is choice, right? The town elders of Troy were suspicious of Helen who was stolen from her husband by this guy named Paris. Paris is Priam's son, right? The town elders of Troy are suspicious of the beauty of Helen. What does that mean? Well, it means that Priam, in fact, failed to educate his son and therefore suffered the consequences of a failure to choose the good in educating his son, and in probably, if you wanted to avert the tragedy of Troy and the Trojan War, it's very simple. You have to send Helen back. But Priam didn't do that. And what seemed in book one to be an awful Job-like suffering of misfortune is actually in part, not entirely, but in part, a failure to exercise virtue. And so if there is a way in which happiness is in fact up to us as human beings, right, the way in which it is up to us is in the exercise of virtue, which is a learning how to see the places where we might have choice where we never saw them before. Right? There are so many places where we fail to exercise choice in our lives because we fail to see ourselves. And so the truest invitation I think that Aristotle gives us is the invitation to philosophy, which is the quest for self-knowledge, which is a learning how to see ourselves in the midst of the circumstances that we find ourselves and to choose the good there. So it's about time for me to stop talking and we can go from there.
I think I'm too old to apply to the Honors College at Belmont. I could do this every day because that was fantastic and amazing. I do have a question, and students, we have a small enough group. You can use kind of the hand raising feature, and I think you can actually talk that. So we'll do that in a minute. And Dr. Basil just talked about courage, so we'll look for that first brave soul to kind of put themselves out there. But I'm wondering, your Belmont Abbey being such a richly Catholic college, how do you, sometimes can you even forget when you're deep in Aristotle that you're not reading a Catholic saint? Do you feel like?
Yeah, I always start the semester reading Aristotle or Plato. One of the things I guess at a Catholic school is there are a lot of students who've come from Christian backgrounds, and it makes for a great atmosphere. But one of the things that means is it's very tempting to read things from the catechism back into Aristotle, when in fact it goes the opposite way. So students who have been raised reading the catechism, a catechism is sort of the short version of Thomas Aquinas, who in so many ways is the student of Aristotle. And so one of the things that I do to scandalize my students, and I don't know if I should say this, but I will, but is I just tell them, like, you in a certain way you need to check your Christianity at the door, not actually, but in a certain way you don't want to read into Aristotle Christian revelation because it wasn't available to him. And one of the reasons I actually think it's more pious to do that, I actually do think it's more pious, is because if you read Christian revelation into Aristotle and just say, well, what he meant to say was John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If you read Christian revelation into Aristotle, you miss your opportunity to see what human reason, taking on its own terms, most deeply longs for. You actually failed to see, I think, that the incarnation is beyond what I could ever articulate, is the answer to the deepest longings that human beings have prior to Christian revelation. And that if you don't see the question first, it's you don't see the profundity of the answer of in the person of Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ is the incarnate answer to the question of happiness. But if it becomes almost cliche to say that without seeing the question and knowing how deep our need for redemption is.
Love that. We do have a brave soul, Skylar, first, so we're gonna hit the allowed to talk button here. All right, so Skylar, say hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Um, for someone who's never read Aristotle before, I was wondering, is the Nicomachean Ethics the best place to start, or is there another work of his that would be better to start with?
It's a great question.
It is. Well, I'll answer it this way. Aristotle is not a walk in the park for a couple reasons. One of them is just that he writes in Attic Greek, and he has a weird style. So most classicists really hate Aristotle's Greek because it's kind of funky. So that means that you run into a twofold problem when reading Aristotle, and that is it's translated, and it's translated. If it's translated well, it looks clunky, and even in the best English. So I think the Ethics is probably the best book to read, but if you pick it up on your own and you're like, this is hard, I would have to confess that the first quiz I might have failed in college might have been on Aristotle's Ethics, because it's just so unusual the first time you encounter it, right? It's hard to know what's important. He uses so many ambiguous words. So I do think the Ethics is maybe there are certain parts of it that are very clear, and then there are certain parts that I still have to really wrestle with. And so it's the first time around, it's almost more conducive in a conversational setting, which means you should probably come and just hang out with us in the Honors College. But
I love that.
no, I do think if you're going to pick up Aristotle, probably the Ethics. But if you pick it up and it doesn't grip you like Jane Austen might, that's okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, that is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So give it a go. I think Jane Austen read Aristotle, to be honest. I think Pride and Prejudice is actually an answer to Aristotle's question about this thing called the great souled man. So if you really want to read Aristotle, probably start with Jane Austen is my best advice. But then just give it a go and see what happens.
Love that. We got Grace Gardner and students and maybe parents as well in the room. Feel free to ask any questions about Aristotle, but also any questions you may have about Belmont Abbey or the Honors College of Belmont Abbey as well. So kind of anything goes. So, all right, Grace Gardner, you are on. I think you're on mute right now, Grace. You know when to hit that.
So you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so a few years ago, I actually read what Aristotle had to say about the soul, and I find myself almost disagreeing because he puts everything into like 3 different categories, but then I learned about certain animals who have almost rational aspects. For example, elephants, they almost think thoughts in certain situations. Like if someone falls to the ground and they just stop moving, they'll put leaves on top of them as almost like honoring their death if they think they're dead. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about what Aristotle says about the soul.
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's a grandly ambitious question. There's a couple things. One is that, I mean, when Aristotle talks about the soul, it's so complicated. And in the Ethics, it's a central focus. So the way I would go about thinking about this is what distinguishes human beings from animals for Aristotle is their capacity for logos, which is reason or speech or reasoned speech. And when Aristotle in the Ethics, not in the Ethics, in his Politics actually defines this. And what he says is that man is a political animal unlike any other gregarious animal because of his possession of speech. And that speech is more than just talking. So it's talking about specific things. It's talking about the just, the noble, and the good. And he says an agreement in these things makes a household and also a city. So it's actually by virtue of the fact that you can talk about justice that you have speech. So this is where I think you are a little bit different than an elephant, right? And elephants, and this doesn't mean elephants aren't fascinating, but think about this. I would use the example of maybe a dog, right? So animals have what Aristotle calls voice, and voice allows us to express pleasure and pain, right? When you talk to a baby, you might have like a slightly different voice because it's so cute. And like when we use our voice, it communicates pleasure and pain. You can tell when someone's angry and when they're not. It's a sign that I'm in pain or not. So, for example, if you failed to feed your dog is probably going to whine and cry and look very sad. The one thing your dog is not going to do is say, Grace, you are a terrible and unjust master. I'm going to sue you, take you to court, and make sure that all of the world knows what a terrible person you are. You are unjust and you are bad owner, bad, right? So I think that's more along the lines of what Aristotle has to say when he's talking about speech. It's not that animals can't communicate and don't have a certain calculative function of mind, but there's something qualitatively different about human beings. We're not just clever animals, because we also think about whether or not we ought to do something or ought not to do something. We think about justice.
We'll do maybe one or two more here. Looks like we have one coming in here from Angelina Gardner as well. So Angelina.
You guys all sisters?
Yes, we are.
Okay, fair. Double trouble.
I am a junior at Great Hearts, and I just had the pleasure of reading the 5 dialogues from Plato. And
Which 5?
Sorry?
Which 5?
Actually, we read 4. So Meno, Euthyphro, the Apology, and Credo. So in Meno, I actually got frustrated with Socrates a lot because he ends the dialogue with saying that virtue is just a gift from the gods, which is the most frustrating answer after you've gone through this dialogue and all of Socrates' questioning of, what is virtue? When the dialogue just starts off with Meno asking, is virtue teachable? And then hearing about what Aristotle said about virtue, I was already comparing it to Meno's dialogue, right? So virtue as a muscle. So I was wondering what you thought about that, because I mean, after reading Meno, I sat with my teacher and I talked to him for 30 minutes about virtue. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit. Who do you basically agree with more? I don't know. I was comparing those two very often.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Meno, and I also find it frustrating. And I agree with you completely that I find Socrates' answers to Meno largely dissatisfying. And the way I tend to read that dialogue is really the way I read all dialogues, is that Socrates' responses and how we understand what he's saying is always in relation to the person he's talking to. So just one thing to notice about Meno throughout, and Socrates, do you remember that part in the dialogue where Socrates says, Meno, I can tell that you're handsome and have many lovers because you bully people. You're very
Yes, right. I remember this. And I was thinking, oh my goodness. Okay.
I mean, it's weird, but it helps you understand what's going on, right? Meno is that overly cocky guy in your class who thinks he knows everything because he thinks because he's good looking and he's always had it his way, right? So that means what Socrates seems to be seeing in him is something that is true of the historical Meno, is that he's a potential tyrant, right? Someone who's always had his own way. Right? And so what does that mean? Well, if you're talking to a potential tyrant, how do you talk to that person? Well, you're talking to someone who thinks he's God. And so the best thing that Socrates could teach Meno is, first of all, you know nothing, which is it does pretty effectively. And second of all, maybe there is something to think about with the divine, and maybe you're not it, So in a nutshell, I actually think Aristotle often has the Meno in mind when he's talking about virtue and whether or not it's teachable, because he raises it precisely, almost in Meno's language, that formulation about virtue. But I think what Socrates is doing there is educating a particular soul, right, who needs a particular form of correction. And the best thing for Mino would be a kind of openness to the divine, which would allow him to maybe not be such a tyrant.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I was wondering what maybe you thought, because with Mino, obviously he's basically this very prideful tyrant who was a student under Gorgias, who made many speeches about what virtue was and thought of himself on a higher pedestal than everyone else. But I just wonder what his answer would have been to someone who's just, I know they weren't called peasants back then, but someone who's a part of a lower class, for someone who doesn't think of himself as a god or something like that. Because then it's like Socrates ends with saying virtue is a gift from the gods, but then with Aristotle, he says that virtue is really the only thing that we can control, right? So it just it's very different how they view virtue. So I just thought that was really interesting. But thank you so much for answering that. That was really helpful.
Yeah, more to be said on that for sure, but
Awesome. Students, I put in the chat here a link actually to the Scola summer program that the Honors College does every year. I've heard amazing things about the program. I think like rafting and all kinds of cool activities are part of the week. Dr. Basil, to conclude here, can you tell us a bit about the Scola summer program and just kind of like getting, what is kind of a good next step if students are interested in Belmont Abbey?
Yeah, well, I know we have a scholarship weekend coming up in like maybe 2 weeks because we have, I think, 5 full rides that we're offering, and that hopefully is going to be a continuous thing. So we're always working on, we always keep tuition down, but we're always working on getting bigger and better opportunities for our students. So that's totally worth looking into if you're applying. And then I always look forward to our Scola summer program because it's a week with a bunch of enthusiastic high school students who like to do all the same things I do, which is, read great books in the morning and then hike or go to museums or baseball games in the afternoon. And it tends to be run by our best and brightest current students. I've done it for, I think, 3 summers in a row, and I just love it. So it's a great way to get a feel for the college. And I can't remember if this is still happening, but we used to give tuition discounts for students who came to Belmont Abbey after coming to the Scola program. So I have to double check on that.
Do your students, are you a tutor like TAC, or are you a professor at the Honors College of Belmont Abbey?
I'm a professor who doesn't profess much. Except my Catholic faith. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, love that response. Well, I know a few students who have had you already, and I know you are dearly loved at the Honors College of Belmont Abbey. So students, again, do check it out. Dr. Basil, this has been a treat. This recording and all of our recordings are going to be on our YouTube channel as well, so definitely check that out. And thank you again. We'll hopefully do this again with you in the very near future.
Thanks, guys.
All right, students, we'll see you next week if you can make it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.